On the morning of May 5th, 2009, the quiet routine of a small town in Illinois was shattered by a scene straight out of a nightmare. Inside an ordinary-looking house, police came face to face with something no one could ever forget. Walls covered with threatening messages, in the bedrooms, an irreversible tragedy. The words written in red seemed to scream, "You paid. Punished." But who wanted to punish this family? And why? This is a kind of mystery that exposes the darkest side of human nature. A story where love, betrayal, and ambition collide with blood, leading to one of the most controversial trials in recent U.S. history. And before we dive into this disturbing case together, let me invite you. If you enjoy real stories, in-depth investigations, and true crime cases that feel like movie scripts, make sure to subscribe to Dr. Investigation. Here, every episode is built with seriousness, detail, and respect for victims, so you can uncover what really happened behind the headlines. Now, take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear may completely change the way you see trust, loyalty, and even the sense of safety inside a home. Before the tragedy, the Colemans were seen as the picture of a model family. Christopher Coleman held a respected position. He was the head of security for a well-known televangelist, a role that gave him status, stability, and respect within the religious community he lived in. Sheri, his wife, was described as a sweet woman, devoted to her two sons, Garett and Gavin, and active in the local church. The Coleman household seemed perfect, an organized home, family portraits smiling from the walls, and the image of a solid marriage. But behind closed doors, not everything was as harmonious as it appeared. The marriage was already strained, marked by quiet tension, growing arguments, and emotional distance between Christopher and Sheri. And, as so often happens in cases that end in tragedy, the warning signs were overlooked until it was too late. This contrast between appearance and reality is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. How could a family that seemed so exemplary become the scene of one of the most chilling crime scenes ever uncovered? That's what we're going to explore together. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Dr. Investigation. Here you'll find in-depth investigations, narratives that reveal hidden details, and real stories that expose the darkest side of human nature. Now that you know who the Colemans were, it's time to understand how the first shadow of this tragedy began to take shape. The sudden threats that changed everything. It was inside the seemingly perfect home that the first signs of trouble began to surface. Christopher Coleman, the man tasked with protecting the life of a famous televangelist, claimed that he himself and his family had become the targets of threats. At first, they were cryptic emails, short messages filled with bitterness, written in an almost prophetic tone, as if they were divine judgments announcing punishment. Soon after, these warnings escalated into anonymous letters, delivered in mysterious ways, each repeating the same chilling idea. Christopher had crossed an invisible line, and now everyone would pay the price. These were not just insults. They were calculated statements, almost theatrical, filled with disturbing phrases like, "You will be punished," or "Your time is coming." To many, they looked like revenge aimed at the televangelist, an indirect attack on the man under Coleman protection. But for Sheri, Christopher's wife, each word printed on paper became a suffocating weight, turning the safety of her home into a prison of fear. What was most intriguing was the pattern behind these threats. They appeared at specific moments, almost as if someone was deliberately building a well-crafted narrative. Police and close acquaintances began to notice that the messages contained intimate details, the kind only someone with direct access to the Coleman family could know. This raised a disturbing question. Were they dealing with an outside stalker or someone much closer? This mystery surrounding the threats is crucial to understanding the complexity of the case. What first appeared to be a warning from external forces eventually became one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, exposing truths far darker than anyone could have imagined. And before we move on to the moment when these threats stopped being words and turned into reality, make sure to subscribe to Dr. Investigation. Here, every detail, every piece of evidence, and every contradiction is explored in depth, so you can uncover the real face behind the crimes that shocked the world. Now, brace yourself, because the next step in the story is the most terrifying one, the day when the writing on the wall turned into blood. On the morning of May 5th, 2009, Christopher Coleman followed the same routine as always. He left home early to work out at a nearby gym, just as he regularly did. To the neighbors, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just a man keeping up with his daily habits while his wife and children were still asleep. But inside the house, the silence was hiding a macabre scene that would soon be revealed. When Christopher tried calling Sheri and got no answer, he contacted family friends and eventually the police. What officers found when they opened the door would forever mark the small town of Columbia, Illinois. The walls were covered with threatening phrases written in red. "You paid." "Punished." Words that echoed the same tone as the anonymous letters received in the weeks before. In the bedrooms, the most brutal discovery. Sheri, just 31 years old, and the couple's two sons, Garett, 11, and Gavin, only 9, were dead. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of an intruder struggling to get in. The killer seemed to have moved freely through the house without resistance. And the messages left on the walls suggested this was more than just an attack. It looked like some kind of ritual of punishment. The scene was so disturbing that many officers struggled to put it into words in their reports. The contrast between the family portraits hanging on the walls and the horror of the crime was almost unbearable. Right there before investigators' eyes, a cruel narrative was taking shape. Threats that once seemed to come from outside had now materialized in blood inside the Coleman home. And this is where I remind you, if you want to uncover real stories that reveal how far human nature can go, make sure to subscribe to Dr. Investigation. Every episode here is built with depth and seriousness, so you can understand not only the crime itself, but also what it reveals about the fragility of trust and family life. The Coleman case had now shifted from a story of threats to a bloody enigma. Who wrote those messages on the walls? Who could have committed such a cruel act? These questions would guide every step of the investigation that followed. The investigation began with a shock. How could someone enter a home without signs of forced entry, murder 3 people, and still leave messages on the walls without alerting neighbors or family? To the police, this scene didn't look like the work of just any intruder. It was something planned, almost rehearsed. The first analyses focused on the threats Christopher had received. They were the most obvious lead. But as examiners studied the papers in ink, they noticed inconsistencies. The tone of the letters felt artificial, repetitive, as if someone was trying too hard to simulate hatred. Later, handwriting experts pointed out something even more unsettling. The writing on the walls and the letters closely matched Christopher's own handwriting. Meanwhile, investigators dug into digital traces. Christopher's alibi began to crumble when GPS data, phone records, and surveillance footage failed to match his story. The very minutes he claimed to be away from the house coincided with the likely time of the murders. Every technical detail seemed to close the net tighter around him. But the investigation wasn't only about physical evidence. There was also the human side. Friends and acquaintances began to describe changes in Christopher's behavior, his growing distance from his family, frequent irritability, and a strange lack of emotion in the face of tragedy. The grief that should have been devastating appeared cold, detached. And then came the final piece of the puzzle. A mistress in Florida. A secret, intense relationship that revealed plans for a new life. Without his wife, without his children, without the weight of a broken marriage. For investigators, the motive was becoming clearer. Freedom. The desire to reinvent himself, even if the price was his own family. Step by step, the image of the respected head of security, the trusted man of the church, was falling apart. What remained was the dark portrait of someone willing to manipulate, deceive, and destroy to get what he wanted. And this is why I remind you, subscribe now to Dr. Investigation. Here, you'll see how small details, a signature, a car route, a suspicious call, can become the key pieces to solving crimes that once seemed unsolvable. By this point, the Coleman case was no longer a mystery. It was a ticking time bomb headed for the courtroom, and with each new piece of evidence, the question shifted from who could have done this to how did Christopher Coleman ever think he could get away with it? As the investigation progressed, the Coleman case took an unexpected turn. What at first seemed like a mystery filled with outside threats began to reflect back inside the very walls of the home. Handwriting experts were unequivocal. The messages on the walls were not written by some shadowy stalker. They matched the same hand that signed Christopher Coleman's checks, notes, and documents. This discovery shattered the narrative of an external enemy and revealed something far more disturbing: the possibility that the entire charade of threats had been orchestrated by Christopher himself. But handwriting was only the beginning. Digital records painted an even darker picture. GPS data and phone logs showed that Christopher was not at the gym during the critical time frame, as he had claimed. He hadn't just lied, he had miscalculated his own alibi, leaving behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs that exposed his contradictions. As investigators pieced the puzzle together, another element surfaced: emails exchanged with his mistress in Florida. They spoke of plans to start over, of a new life free from obligations. But not once did they mention separation or divorce. For Christopher, there was no room for compromise. The solution, in his mind, seemed to be the complete erasure of his wife and children. This was the moment when the investigation flipped upside down. The image of the devoted family man, the trusted church security chief, not only crumbled, but gave way to the portrait of a cold, calculating man behind a premeditated tragedy. The storyline of a victim dissolved, and in its place stood the figure of the main villain. And once again, I invite you, subscribe now to Dr. Investigation. Here, every hidden detail, every overlooked piece of evidence, and every contradiction comes to life, exposing the raw truth behind the most haunting crimes in history. By this point, the Coleman case was no longer an unsolved puzzle. It was a brutal portrait of how appearance and reality can collide. And when that collision happens, the mask doesn't slip slowly. It shatters all at once. 2 years after the murders, in 2011, Christopher Coleman finally took his place in the defendant's chair. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, members of the religious community, and even people from out of state filled the benches, all drawn by the same haunting question: could this man, who had dedicated his life to protecting a spiritual leader, have planned and carried out the murder of his own family? The prosecution presented a meticulous case. Handwriting experts displayed side-by-side comparisons of the threatening letters, the messages scrawled on the walls, and documents signed by Christopher. The similarities were so striking that they required little explanation. Then came the GPS and phone records, which dismantled his alibi with surgical precision. Every call, every movement logged by his phone revealed a Christopher very different from the one he described in his testimony. The final blow came with the exchanges between him and his mistress. They were living proof that he was planning a new life, one free from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. More shocking still, never once did he mention divorce. For the prosecution, this was evidence that Christopher saw only one solution: to erase his family entirely. The defense tried to plant seeds of doubt. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that the threats could have been forged, that Christopher was the victim of a setup. But each argument collapsed under the weight of the technical evidence and the chilling coldness of the accused. Throughout the trial, Coleman rarely showed emotion. To many, his detached demeanor wasn't the mark of an innocent man. It was indifference. The verdict came swiftly: guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was final: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, relief mingled with grief. Family members of the victims wept quietly, while part of the community still struggled to accept that the exemplary man they once admired had been unmasked as a calculating killer. This trial didn't just convict Christopher Coleman. It shattered the illusion of a perfect life and exposed how ambition, selfishness, and betrayal can fuel unimaginable tragedy. And before we continue, I invite you once again, subscribe now to Dr. Investigation. Here, every detail that shapes a trial, every piece of evidence that seals a verdict, and every story that forces us to confront human darkness is revealed in depth. The Coleman case did not end in the courtroom. The conviction was only the beginning of a deeper reflection on appearances, truth, and the shadows that often lurk within the walls of a home. The Coleman case is more than just a criminal investigation. It is a disturbing reminder of how deceptive appearances can be. Behind the facade of a model family lay secrets, betrayals, and a darkness no one could have imagined. Christopher Coleman built a narrative of outside threats to conceal his true intentions, and for a time he managed to fool even those closest to him. But the truth, as always, found its way out. This crime did more than destroy an innocent family. It shook an entire community. exposed the vulnerability of those who trusted a so-called man of faith, and showed just how far ambition and coldness can drive a human being. It was a cruel reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Many times, they live among us, masked by smiles and kind words. The story of the Colemans remains an open wound in the memory of Columbia. And for those who follow this case, one question lingers. How well do we really know the people we trust? How prepared are we to look beyond appearances? And before we close, I want to invite you once again, subscribe now to Dr. Investigation. Here, you'll find in-depth analyses, impactful storytelling, and real cases that reveal the darkest sides of human nature. In every episode, our goal is to help you see beyond the obvious, question the official narratives, and uncover the hidden truths behind each crime. The Coleman case ends with Christopher convicted, but the echo of the tragedy remains. A somber reminder that trust, love, and loyalty can be shattered in the most irreversible ways, and that often the greatest danger doesn't come from outside, but is born within the very walls of home.